Hi, everybody. Welcome to this episode of Great Practice, Great Life. And today we're going to walk right through the middle, the tight wire of how to have great practice and a great life by doing a really fun conversation with Danny Ozment from Emerald Production. So, Danny, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Steve.
Well, I have to have you because you have been my coach, sage, advisor on this podcast. And I think right now, I think our podcast has spawned 4 other podcasts from Atticus friends, clients. And I wanted to bring you on the podcast to talk about just briefly why lawyers should start a podcast, some of the benefits to doing a podcast. And then we'll talk about a couple of case studies of lawyers that are doing podcasts and then some shortcuts for podcasts. So that's my goal. Does that work for you?
Yeah, that works for me.
Okay, so before we get too far, why don't you just give us a brief laser talk about your company, what you guys do, how you support, and then I can tell you our experience working with you and how I found you. Actually, I didn't find you, somebody else found you, but what I've enjoyed working with you and how I've enjoyed that process. So talk to me about your company.
Well, I appreciate it. And it's honestly, it's kind of weird. You may not even know this part of the story, but I found you guys first. Like I was looking and we were talking before we started up here about how you like that I'm a dad and I moved my kids to Florida because we wanted to be close to Disney World so we could do stuff and spend more time as a family. But as part of that, as I was sitting here running my business from the house in Orlando, Florida, I was like, wow, wouldn't it be great if there's some conferences in Orlando that I could go to and I could talk about my business and reach out to some of the industries that we work with. And lo and behold, there's a conference right here in Florida, in Orlando, in the airport, right near me. I was like, oh, who is this group? Oh, Atticus. Okay, interesting. And so I reached out and, started a sponsor relationship and working with that conference, the summit, before we even thought about working with you guys as a podcast. And I think someone saw that there was going to be a podcast sponsor and then sent me an email because, we've been thinking about doing a podcast. Could you talk about this with us? So it's kind of funny how it started. But how the business started, I was a musician and had eventually started a recording studio where I was working with musicians. And just like, all the lawyers out there, members of Atticus that are trying to grow their firms and develop more of a business as a leader of their firm and take more time for themselves, I was realizing that the business model of working with musicians was just not great. Budgets were not great. Musicians don't think of themselves as business people. They don't think of themselves as running a business. They're not. Some of them are entrepreneurial, some of them aren't. And I would get involved in projects that would go on for years. And it would take forever to get paid when work was done. And it just got very frustrating. So I started to think about diversifying. And I really enjoyed listening to podcasts. I think like a lot of us now, almost 60% of people in North America are listening to podcasts or have listened to one. I was enjoying podcasts. They were helping me. I was learning stuff about my business and how I could grow my business through them. And then it occurred to me, well, what about podcasters? I could help podcasters because some of these shows just don't sound good. I could just help them sound great. And I reached out to a few that I was listening to, and they were happy to have a real recording engineer help them sound better and work on their podcast. And it grew from me doing $40 an episode by myself to, oh yeah, sure, I can write your show notes. Oh, okay, I can do social media too. Oh yeah, we can do some YouTube stuff. Okay. I got to add a team member. Okay, let's get some more editors. And now it's grown into this business where I'm really no longer the face of the business. We have a director of operations, a business development manager, operations manager, editors, copywriters. We, like many people, have started to explore how do we use AI to make things go faster. We have account managers that are interacting with some of our clients. And we have settled into this world of who can we help most with podcasts? And we can talk about the why a lot, but the singular why of podcasting for most businesses comes down to podcasts help you build trust with an audience, with potential audience, which are potential clients. And I started to think about, well, who needs to build trust? There's a lot of independent podcasters out there, and there's entertainment podcasts, but it comes down to, well, the small business, the professional service provider is the business that operates in a community that needs to find a way for someone to trust them enough to walk in the door, or to call them, to email them, to get help from them. And it occurred to me that services like lawyers, doctors, accountants, therapists, chiropractors, they can benefit from sharing their expertise and their authority on a podcast to build trust that then generates revenue for them in some way, whether that's client leads, or whether that's selling products, or whether that's subscribing to monthly services, retainers, anything, that memberships that they can talk about and share on their podcast.
So the first one I'd like to highlight, if it's okay with you, is Annette Hines. Are you familiar with Annette's story?
Yeah. Parenting Impossible. And you actually shared this podcast with me initially, and I was like, oh, this is great, because I know a couple other lawyers in this space who could do that type of podcast. And if you can certainly share more, but the idea is that Annette is a what we would call special needs attorney, or I guess disability, that type of focus. And she's also a parent of a child with an exceptional child, is I think the terminology that gets used now. And rather than just start a podcast that was about, I'm going to teach all the people that need to know this stuff about these things so that they'll come and hire me, she just really created a resource for other parents of special needs children. And that's the idea of, if you have an expertise, you don't necessarily just have to think about revenue or building trust for potential clients. You can use your expertise to help the world, to do something good, to advocate. I think about like how helpful that is, especially when you're talking to a community that is stressed and has no time to do this type of research and needs the help, and never I think about my journey as a special needs parent, and how think whatever, that we had a social worker in the NICU that told us about certain things that we could take advantage of. And that started that was where we first met the attorney that would help us get into a birth injury fund that would help with our child, and still helping with our child. And we wouldn't have learned about that. We have another client who's not in the legal world, but he owns a communication tower building company. He builds cell phone towers and communication towers all throughout the Southeast. And he could totally make a ton of money. He makes a ton of money doing that. He could totally do a podcast about that and teach the industry more about how to build better towers, or how to get connections with other big cell phone companies and communications providers. But no, what did he decide to do? He came up as being a tower climber, a worker himself, and that's how he started his business. And he realized that no one was advocating for them. So his podcast was all about advocating for the worker, for safety, for all these things that are needed in the industry. And so he's establishing himself now as a pillar in that industry, someone that people can go to when they need help or advice, or a leader in their professional groups and organizations.
So if you said, what are the 3 biggest mistakes lawyers make when they go to start a podcast? I have a couple. What are the ones that jump to your mind? Like you say, okay, this is a mistake, this is a mistake, this is a mistake.
Sure. Well, I want to hear you. What is your first one? What is the biggest mistake that you made? You consider.
I'll give you all 3. Number 1 is we spent 5 years discussing it. So we spent a lot of time discussing it, trying to name it, trying to brand it, wrestling with it. I still have probably 30 or 40 or 50, maybe 100 names that we had with it.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until we repivoted around Great Practice, Great Life that the name for the show became obvious. And so we have a whole bunch of different names that we were wrestling with. And it just didn't feel right. Like I didn't like any of them.
Yeah,
And
that's always number 2 on my list, that if you obsess over anything, whether it's the format of your podcast, how often it should come out, how long the episode should be, should it just be you as the host? Should you have co-hosts? What day of the week should it come out on? What does my artwork look like? What music should we have? Anything like that is keeping you from reaching an audience. Like the beauty of a podcast is that you can put it out and you can evolve with your audience. You can ask them what they need, and they can tell you and they can give you feedback, and you can learn things. Like you do a lot of interviews. You can learn things from the people that you're talking with and decide, oh, wow, okay, we should cover this topic more. And your next 5 episodes can be on that. So with a podcast, you like I said, that's number 2 on my list, is you got to start ugly. Just don't wait, because podcast listeners, as long as the podcast sounds okay, they're very forgiving, because it's long. It's the thing people go to now in terms of content when they want to hear a discussion, when they want to hear people work through something, share a long story. Like that's why people go to podcasts. So you definitely don't want to make that mistake.
So those are probably the big 3. Any that you don't like to add on that?
Oh yeah, I mean, and that's a good one, because like podcast is sort of a proving ground where you can try things out, and because you're repurposing it, you can create a bunch of different things from it. You get even more input from different audiences about, well, what are you talking about? And you mentioned this one little thing in that episode. Could you talk about that more? And you are like, wow, it never occurred to me that that's what people would want to hear. And you can go down it. So, and I kind of already touched on the other one. A lot of the do-it-yourself idea also often leads to bad sound quality. And if you can get a little bit of advice on, like with you, I was like, hey, get this microphone. Don't use this other. I think you had a microphone where we were saying, that's not going to be the best one for all environments. Because it's like a restaurant. If a restaurant served inedible food, you wouldn't go back. So a podcast sounding bad, people aren't going to stick around for long. As good, even if the content is great. A lot of people get into podcasts and they think, they're used to hearing YouTube numbers of like thousands of views and millions of views, or they're used to hearing, wow, this post on Facebook got 500 likes. Podcasts don't go viral like that. They are you think about them, they're longer. You put them out, people have to, luckily Google prioritizes podcast content in their search results. You have these podcast apps where people can search for topics. People are going to podcasts to learn. And so they find something and they spend a good amount of time with a podcast before they even tell another person they're listening to something. They sit with it, so they don't go viral, which means with a podcast, giving up too soon is a really big mistake. I'll be very flat out with this. We don't even sign contracts with new clients now without a 6-month commitment, because I tell them flat out, like, yes, it's great to have a 6-month commitment from you because it helps my budget, but it's also because I know the podcast will fail if you don't do 6 months. You have to stick with it. You have to be out there. You have to build up this audience that trusts you, cares enough about you to tell other people before it really takes off and you start to see that momentum.